Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy. I'm your host, Steve, and we are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, including Scott Rank's History Unplugged, James Early's Key Battles of American History, and Richard Lim's This American President. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. I'd like to quickly mention we are on Patreon. We have 4 tiers: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. There's so many benefits to joining, and not only do you get benefits, but you also help greatly in keeping this whole show going. So I definitely highly encourage you to at least check out joining us on patreon.com/history of the papacy. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, and Sarah at the Alexandria level. We have Dapo, Paul, Justin, and Lana, all of whom are magnificent at Constantinople level. And reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great. In today's episode, Dr. Carolyn McNamara of the University of Glasgow will lead us through the early conversion of the Irish to Christianity. We'll talk about some of the sources we can look for more information, as well as how we should and shouldn't interpret those sources. Now with that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. All right, let's dive right back into the history of Christianity in the British Isles. We are joined again by Dr. Carolyn McNamara of the University of Glasgow to lead us through this fascinating period in history. We've discussed a great deal of information already in this series, so what will we be focusing in on today?
Yeah, so today, we've talked about the ancient Celts and we've talked about the coming of Christianity to Ireland and Northern Britain. So today I really wanted to focus on, what does the church look like when it's getting settled into this new area? We're looking at areas that are kind of beyond the direct control of the Roman Empire. And so it's nice to see kind of what they do with Christianity once they kind of get their hands properly around it.
And so we are dealing with these areas outside of the Roman Empire. So now we really should start off talking about sources and what can we use to derive some ideas from this time period.
Yeah, that's a great point. So there's a number of different kinds of sources that we can look at for this period. We even see in, juridical or legal documents that survive from the medieval period, information about Christianity that's really starting to become codified. But, there's hagiographies, which your readers are like, or your listeners, readers, I'm funny. Your listeners are likely familiar with hagiographies in that they are, stories of the lives of saints. But we have to give a huge caveat to that in that it's not like a biography that we might read of, former President Obama or, some other well-known person today. It's not going to be that kind of story. Hagiographies have lots of miracles. There's usually lots of telling the future that's going on in there. So we have to be really careful in how we approach and work with them. There's annals. And so annals I liked to talk about as, if someone's keeping their daily diary in a monastery of the big things that the monastery is interested in. So they're recording the deaths of kings, they're recording maybe eclipses in the sky, earthquakes that might happen, big battles, or the deaths of important abbots or bishops in their local area. So we're getting, a lot of information from them, but it tends to be pretty sparse. It's like, on this day, there was a battle at this place, and this guy won. And that's the whole entry. So we have to use them as a skeleton upon which we might be able to build some additional detail. And then we've got liturgical books. We've got antiphonary, which contain chants for use during Mass or the canonical hours. And indeed, one of the earliest antiphonary that survives is from the early 8th century, I believe. It's the antiphonary of Bangor and Bangor Monastery there in the north of Ireland, or what we'd call today Northern Ireland, and the fact that something like that exists from so early is just thrilling and fascinating. So you can get, if you're interested in kind of the liturgical side of what the church is doing, rather than what I look at more as kind of the historical side, those kinds of things are really useful. There's martyrologies, which are, of course, kind of lists of saints and their feast days. Sometimes we might get a smidge of additional information with those, but they tend to be, again, fairly bare bones. We also have, for Scotland, it's quite useful, the Aberdeen Breviary, although it wasn't compiled until 1510 in Edinburgh at the behest of King James IV. It's kind of the first big document that we've got that lists all these saints that are considered important in Scotland, and it includes a lot of early, Christian saints. So that's really useful for us. We also have what are called histories, and I like to put this with a kind of quotations around the word histories, because it's not, again, what we might think of, when you think of your textbook from your history class in high school or university. It's not going to be anything like that. So we can't approach them the same way that we might those books in our present time. So we view histories today as kind of this nonpartisan or objective account of events of the past. But in this deep past, in the medieval period, they just didn't exist the same way. So we have to think about what's the purpose of these authors writing, and remember that writing in and of itself was an expensive activity for the most part. And so it's not like you're going to have every, Milrua and Diarmait and such writing. So it takes something, or it means something for them to be putting this material down. And some excellent examples of these histories that survive, and amazingly so, are Gildas, who was a 6th century Romano-Briton. He wrote, or he's best known for writing De Excidio Britanniae, or On the Destruction of Britain. He's pretty well known for hating almost everyone, except sometimes the Romans. And then we've got Bede, who is a late, 7th or 8th century Northumbrian monk from Wearmouth Yarrow in England. He took a number of pages from Gildas's book. So you see this similar kind of, it's usually hating on the Britons or the Welsh, but he added some of his own information to it. Bede also wrote his own life of St. Cuthbert at the request of the community of St. Cuthbert. So we want to keep an eye on, both of these are religious men in religious orders. And so what is the purpose they have of writing these things? What are they trying to express, or what's their goal? Who's their audience when we think about working with these sources?
And now a word from our sponsors. When you're working with these sources, what kind of methodology do you use maybe inside of individual sources? And is there a way that you combine sources to kind of cross-check them?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things that I always like to think about is, what is the context in which this author is writing? Who is he? Where is he? When is he? So we've got that kind of basic context to situate him in. And then we think about who's his audience. So is he writing to a king, or, hoping a king will read it? Is he writing for a religious audience? Is this something for his monks to read? Is this, in the case of Gildas, a kind of general societal, thing that he's writing about to just tell society how much it sucks, which kind of is what he's doing there. So we want to think about all of these things. And so, if you can get through to answering some of those questions, you can start to see some of maybe the bias that comes through. And Gildas, I would say, is definitely biased against the Britons. Everything they do is terrible. And he talks about the Angles and the Saxons coming in as this just retribution from God. So you got to kind of put that into your basket that you've got when working with Gildas and go, okay, are we going to believe everything he says about how inept and cowardly the Britons are when we know that he's, kind of railing against society in general here? So we're probably going to take that with maybe a mountain of salt instead of just a grain. And as you say, cross-referencing sources as much as we can. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of other writing going on at the same time as Gildas. There are some poems that are coming from Wales and the Old North, which we might think of today as kind of southern Scotland, that are poems written by professional poets in praise of their kings. And so Gildas also writes these really mean and unhappy letters to, I think it's 5 different kings in Wales. And you can take that and counterbalance it against this praise poetry that you get from these professional poets and go, right, so they both have a purpose in their writing. Gildas, of course, is trying to talk about, Christianity and right behavior in regards to Christianity. And then you've got these professional poets whose job is to increase the reputation of their king, period, kind of situation. And so you can set them against each other and go, right, so the truth is probably somewhere in the middle for these. And other times you might find some sources that say the same thing or something very similar. And you can go, right, okay, well, if we've got 2 different guys in 2 different places talking about the same kind of thing, then we might be able to trust it a little bit more.
Then with something like Annals, where maybe somebody writes a note that there was an earthquake or there was something that happened, are there examples, really big examples, where they wrote something and it's actually backed up by archaeology or by some other source? Or are there ones where on the opposite side where somebody writes of a big event and there's just no record whatsoever to support that?
Yeah, so one of the great things with the Annals is that since they record eclipses, sometimes we can go back and go, would there have been an eclipse in this year or, in this period of time, depending on how specific the annal is getting for us, we can sometimes go back and go, yeah, okay, there was an eclipse around that time. So that's something that maybe we can believe a bit more. As far as there not being any archaeological evidence, there are some understandings we have to have, and that just because there's no archaeological evidence for something may not necessarily be evidence that it didn't happen. We might have the wrong place for where we think a battle was, or we just didn't dig in the right spots when we were at that site, because archaeology tends to be, a targeted effort and not to excavate an entire area. So there's that. But then there is also sometimes a retrospective entry that's made when the annals are compiled, or if they're recompiled later, they might put retrospective entries in. And one that I can think of offhand is this entry that says in the year 500 AD, Fergus Mór MacEirc went from Ireland into Scotland. And of course, they didn't say Scotland because Scotland didn't exist at the time, but went into the west of Scotland with part of his people and died there. And that is a big part of where this idea of this movement or invasion of Irish people into the west of Scotland in the year 500 AD got started. And, there's this whole kind of, I don't want to call it a mythology, but this created history that people made and continued to make throughout the medieval period in constructing the history that they wanted for themselves, that suited connections they were wanting to foreground at the time of writing, that sometimes gets into these annals. And we have to realize later on, there's no archaeological evidence whatsoever for invasions in Argyll or the west of Scotland. There's no big cultural shift that would happen, even if it was just an elite, invasion that took over, the highest echelons of society, which, we saw happen with William the Conqueror in 1066 coming in and bringing his French elite. We don't see that in Argyll in 500 AD. And the way that our understanding of that time period and that place is changing is more so that it's more likely that, this Gaelic speaking culture that we see in the early medieval period in the west of Scotland very likely could have developed naturally in situ. So there could have been, cross interactions across the North Channel between the west of Scotland and the north and northeast of Ireland from a long time period. And that's how that happened. But somehow this history got created that had this Fergus Moore MacIrk. And, so we have to be careful about how we're using and understanding these sources. And I think our understanding of them is developing all the time.
Now with the histories, being that we are talking about kind of the fringe of the Roman Empire, where there was a lot of writing and a culture of writing, what did the writing of the histories, did they use templates based on Roman examples or Greek examples, or were they innovating their own genre?
That's a good question. As far as I know, I don't know that they were necessarily, falling into an established, say, Greco-Romano. Sure, I'll go with that as the word. A tradition of writing histories. We know that Greek and Roman authors from the classical period were writing their histories, and we take the same questions to using those sources as we would that I've mentioned for these. But the authors that we have that are writing histories are themselves part of this descended Roman Empire area, Gildas being somewhere in kind of the southern Britain, Wales area. We're not exactly sure. And then Bede himself being in Northumbria, we could still consider these as being in a context that was heavily influenced by Rome before it, receded back to kind of protect its core area versus, we don't have, the same kind of histories coming out of Ireland. I'm not aware of any specific monk who was like, I'm going to write a history of the Irish. When we're looking at these histories, as such, we're usually looking at what we'd think of as external commentators. And that is the situation, even moving as deep into time or into the medieval period as the 12th century, we get some additional external commentators talking about Ireland, especially.
How do you evaluate a source like somebody like Gerald of Wales or Bernard of Clairvaux, who are writing 600-ish years, 600 or so, maybe 800 years later? Are they maybe using some sources that just didn't get passed down the line? What are maybe some of their biases that are getting piled on top?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Gerald of Wales was himself a kind of Welsh Norman cleric. He was from Wales, born in Wales, but of Norman stock. So that gives us a little bit of information about his background and his perspective. And he went to Ireland as part of this, English invasion in the 12th century. So he was writing about his own experiences as he's going through Ireland, but he's doing it through this lens of his own, cultural situation. And, if he's really stuck into this perspective of, this English invasion of Ireland is needed and is, proper, then, we have to take that again with the Hill of Salt, that, we're not necessarily getting an objective explanation from him. Like, he's got a perspective and he's going to give it to us through his writing. And, that's just something that we have to learn how to kind of comb through. And then Bernard of Clairvaux. So he wrote the life of St. Malachy, and St. Malachy became, Bishop of Armagh, I think Archbishop of Down. Like, he became a very important ecclesiastical figure in the north of Ireland in the 12th century. But he was friends with Bernard, and through him kind of got interested in this Cistercian movement that was viewed as a reform movement in the 12th century. So Bernard is looking back to, and the Cistercian movement as a whole is looking backwards in time to about the 6th century. We've got the Benedictine kind of understanding of what monastic life should look like, if I'm remembering that correctly. I think I am. And so they're trying to kind of say, we need to go back to this. And so if you've got somebody who's part of a movement that's kind of viewing itself as this reform movement, and he's writing about the life of Saint Malachy, then we're going to get this perspective of this reform movement, that both Malachy and Bernard were interested in through this life, even though it's talking about Ireland. So I think a lot of that goes to this perception that we have, especially I think in popular understandings of Ireland, as this kind of backwards, out of sync, not up with the times, not in communion with Rome. We might even go so far as to say, view that we've got of Ireland in this early medieval period.
And now a word from our sponsors. It's so weird with Ireland. You either get, and then you start to get into this more modern view that Ireland was kind of the alternative, like the real thing, as opposed to the innovations that were coming in through the Normans and the Romans. Like, it keeps getting reimagined by different generations.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you've got this alternating perspectives. In the classical period, we've got this idea of the barbarians on the periphery. They talk about the Gauls as barbarians. They talk about the Goths as barbarians. So we've got this really kind of barbarian otherness periphery idea. And then at the same time, and you see it also in these classical sources, this romanticization, this kind of noble savage perception of the Celts, and then of Christianity in Ireland and Northern Britain. And so it seems to just go back and forth between these two perceptions. And then you've got in the 18th century and early 19th century, you've got the actual romantic movement. And this is when a lot of the antiquarians are getting started. And you've got all of these really interesting paintings that were being painted in this time of the Picts and of the Druids. And so you've got that big romantic movement coming through, and you've got even more modern religious groups kind of hiving off of that in neo-pagans and neo-Druids, and all of that, again, coming back to this duality of understanding of this peripheral barbarian other and this noble savage.
Who are we've discussed some of these people, but who are maybe some of the big ecclesiastical figures who are going to come up again and again today? Yeah,
so there's so many in Ireland that I could not hope to even, do justice to a quarter of them. But some of the really big names that people are likely to be familiar with are, of course, Patrick, who we've already spent a whole period discussing. There's St. Columba and St. Adamnan. So they're both associated with the monastery at Iona, which is in the west of Scotland. And Adamnan was the 9th abbot of Iona, Columba, of course, being the founder. There's St. Brigid, who was frequently associated with Patrick. And I think even in one of the surviving lives of St. Brigid, it makes the claim that, Brigid was given kind of dominion or control over, all of the monasteries and churches that Patrick hadn't specifically taken control of. So there's this, kind of jockeying for position that happens between the two of them in some of the surviving materials. So her dates are given as kind of 451 to 525, but this is before the records that we're looking at really become reliable. So if we're thinking in terms of the annals, this is that period of those retrospective entries rather than them actually writing them as time kind of plods along. She has the same name as a goddess named Brigid, and it seems extremely likely that this goddess was translated to the new religion. And she's most specifically associated with Kildare. There's actually an order of Brigidine nuns that were reestablished, and in 1993, I think it was, relit a sacred flame that had previously been tended there in Kildare. And so they've gone all the way up till today. They now have a peace and hermitage center in Kildare, and they're just lovely. They do a big week-long series of events for the feast day of St. Brigid, and it's wonderful. If people ever get the opportunity to head over for it, touch wood that we get to where we can travel some more soon, then I highly recommend, getting over there. It's a really wonderful experience. A name that you'll probably hear a lot from me, just because he's kind of the center of my own personal research, is St. Covgall. So he was the founder of Bangor Monastery, which I've mentioned in the north of Ireland, and he lived somewhere between 510 to 602 to give him kind of the widest spread of time. But he's got double entries in the annals, both for his birth and for his death. And that, again, can come into this retrospective position of the annals, if they're compiling things together or they've, misread or misunderstood a date, they might get the double entries. People may already be familiar with Columbanus. So he was a student of Covgall, and he is best known for going back to the continent and founding monasteries in present-day France and Italy. And his dates are from roughly 540 to, we're told that he specifically died on the 21st of November in 615. And we've got that kind of a specific date because a monk that joined Bobbio was the monastery that he finally built there in Italy and died in. So his hagiographer joined the monastery not long after Columbanus died, and then wrote the life of Columbanus kind of within 20, 30 years of his death, having access still to a lot of people that knew Columbanus in their lives. And then another big name that people will probably be familiar with is St. Brendan, also known as Brendan the Navigator. He's well known for a kind of whirlwind sailing trip that he took. That's, I know in Latin called the Navigatio, but I can't remember what it tends to be called in English, but that's his sailing trip. And his dates are given as kind of 484 to 577. So these are generally all of a time. So they potentially all could have known each other, aside from Patrick. He's a bit earlier than that.
On dating, they wouldn't have written in their annal 12/10/456. How do you get to know the dates? Because in different places they use different dating, and even at that time they would have had all different types of reckonings on how people would date things. How did they generally date an item, if they even did?
Yeah, that's a great question. So by the time we're getting to where the annals are being created, so if we believe that they became contemporary, we'll say in the mid 6th century, like mid to late 6th century, then they do have this kind of conception of years since the birth of Christ. And so they'll try to, some of them go so far back as to include the birth of Christ in their annals and then work their way forwards. But we get some details of, honest king of the Picts died in the 10th year of his reign, and they'll give kind of the year that they think that it is. They tend to start every year with the calends of January. So that's where we can kind of go, right, so this is a whole year section. They've got the calends of January here, and then they just start making their lists. they're not always, spot on. We have to do some corrections in, the Annals of Ulster say that this was the year 602, but they've actually got off a little bit. This is actually in 603. So if you're interested in looking at the annals, I actually highly recommend starting with the Chronicle of Ireland, which is a reconstructed annal that it's believed that other annals were based on. And so I think it's Thomas Charles Edwards who put together the Chronicle of Ireland, but I can make sure you've got the details of it to include. So he goes through and kind of puts a number of different annals together and does the date corrections where they're needed. And so he's got a lot of good and useful notes. So if people want to go and have a look at annals, that's a great place to kind of start because it's got a lot of information there together in one place. But yes, somebody originally had to figure out, that these deviations were occurring. And I'm so thankful that earlier historians and earlier specialists in Celtic history did the vast majority of this work before I got on the scene. So I don't necessarily have to worry about that. That's all kind of been thought about before. So I can just work with the information itself.